Hi, everybody. So our next speaker is called James Ungureanu. He is a historian of science and religion, an adjunct professor at Carthage College, where he teaches in the Intellectual Foundations program. So some of you may know Peter Harrison, who is his PhD supervisor, and some of you might have bought his book today. There is one of his books over there in the bookstore, which was co-written with our final speaker, David Hutchings, called Of Popes and Unicorns. His title today is Retracing the Origins of Conflict. So, James.
Thank you to Gavin and CSI for inviting me to speak a little bit about my work. I've been to Britain several times now, and I've always enjoyed it. And I've enjoyed the conversations I've had with a few of you the past couple of days, so I'm very grateful for that. Thank you. I am going to be talking about the elephant in the room here, as it were, the so-called conflict thesis. We might think we know what it is, but what I will try to do is show that it's a little bit more complicated even than what modern contemporary historians of science have said about the narrative, okay? And in order to do that, I have to tell you a story. It's a long story, it's multi-layered, it's very complicated, but hopefully my PowerPoint slides will kind of help along and kind of guide you along the PowerPoint, the story. So over a century, we've been fed a simple story, as it were. So it's about science and religion. Two heavyweight champions locked in an internal struggle. Does this work? Yes. Okay. Duking it out across the ages, this narrative, according to most historians of science and religion, was first popularized in the 19th century by thinkers like John William Draper and Andrew Dixon White. According to historians, Andrew Dixon White and John William Draper painted science and religion as mortal enemies forever in conflict. According to them, religion had its glory days, then science rolled in to save the day, pushing religion out of the way to make room for modernity. That's the conflict thesis in a nutshell, and it stuck around for a long time. The problem is with that story, as historians understand it, it's wrong, or at least far too simplistic. It's done wonders for selling books and captivating movie audiences. It falls actually flat when you're looking at it from a historical perspective. Historians of science have found the conflict thesis simply untrue, and when they look at the history of science and religion, they typically refer to the relationship between science and religion as complicated, as complex. It's a complicated relationship, and it's less like a boxing match and more like a dance, sometimes graceful, sometimes awkward, but always moving. You see, throughout history, the relationship between science and religion isn't neatly categorized as friend or foe. There are patterns, according to historians. For instance, while science might seem increasingly secular today, that wasn't always the case. And in fact, early scientific discoveries was packed with theological references and sentiment. Scientists would often introduce their discoveries with remarks about nature revealing the wisdom and power of God. Over time, however, that language faded. It faded, not because of a knockdown, a drag-out fight between science and religion. Rather, it was more like two gradually developed separate roles in society, each evolving in its own direction. And here where things get a little ironic. In many cases, it was religious leaders who tried to use science to defend the faith, often ended up pushing the two even further apart. And by the time we hit the 20th century, science had largely shed its theological trappings, but not because it was winning a battle. It was simply becoming more specialized, just like everything else in modern life. So where does that leave us? Well, I think it's definitely time to retire both conflict and concord cliches. What we need now is a deeper understanding of how science and religion have actually interacted. And what I propose to do, and I think when you look at the history of science and religion, you're seeing a theological narrative. You're seeing a theological history. You see certain developments in the theological tradition that ultimately led to this perception of conflict. So we will begin really at almost the very beginning. When people talk about the relationship between Christianity and science, they usually start with Tertullian, the sharp-tongued lawyer and early church father. He's famous for asking, what indeed has Athens to do with Jerusalem? What concord is there between the academy and the church? In other words, what business do pagan philosophers have messing with Christian doctrine and vice versa? For Tertullian, these philosophers were chasing after what he called human wisdom that only pretended to know the truth. He even mocked the pre-Socratic philosopher Thales, telling a story that he's pulling from Aristotle of him stumbling into a well while stargazing. He saw it as a fitting metaphor for what he called stupid curiosity. Tertullian comes across as downright antagonistic toward philosophy and by extension what we might call science today. But here's the twist. Tertullian wasn't some anti-intellectual rube. Far from it. He was deeply educated in the Greco-Roman traditions he criticized. His arguments against pagan philosophy was actually constructed using the very tools and methods of that same philosophy. In fact, if we look closely at the early church, we see a more nuanced relationship with Greco-Roman thought. While Christians and pagans clearly had differences in religious belief, there was a significant overlap in political and philosophical ideas. The church fathers didn't reject all things pagan. Most of them were actually educated in pagan schools before converting to Christianity as adults. And when they set out to defend and build Christian doctrine, they couldn't help but borrow from the classical tradition, including its philosophy. Now, Tertullian might have disdained Greek philosophy, especially natural philosophy, but other church fathers were more open to it. You can think of Justin Martyr or Clement of Alexandria or an Origen. These early thinkers didn't just dabble in Greek philosophy, they actively engaged with it, drawing on Platonism and Neoplatonism and even the Aristotelian tradition. Clement of Alexandria, for instance, valued Greek philosophy as a preparatory process to Christianity. He likened it to the law of the Hebrews. To him, Greek philosophy was more than just a stepping stone. It was essential for understanding faith at a deeper level. Sure, you could have faith without philosophy, he said, but if you wanted to truly understand the depths of faith, Clement said, you had to engage with philosophy. Clement even argued that if you wanted to touch the fringes of God's power, you needed to become a philosopher to grapple with the intellectual questions of the day. For him, Christian theology and contemporary Greek philosophy fit together. He was ready to place Christianity squarely within the frameworks of Aristotelian and Platonic thought. St. Augustine, arguably the most influential figure among the early church fathers, took admittedly a more cautious approach, but still very thoughtful when dealing with the classical tradition, including natural philosophy. Unlike some of his contemporaries, St. Augustine believed that pagan philosophy had something to offer Christianity as long as it was used wisely. In many of his writings, St. Augustine argued that elements of the classical tradition could actually serve Christian theology. He famously wrote, "If philosophers have said things that are true and well suited to our faith, they shouldn't be feared. In fact, we should take their ideas from them as though they were unjust possessors and put them to our own use. In other words, truth is truth, no matter where it comes from, and why not claim it? St. Augustine was particularly concerned about Christians who rejected scientific knowledge outright. In his commentaries on Genesis, for example, he didn't hold back his frustration with believers who dismissed what non-Christians had learned about the world. He pointed out that there's valuable knowledge to be had about the earth, about the sky, about the stars, the movement of celestial bodies, the cycles and seasons of the years, and even about animals and plants. And he knew that non-Christians often had this knowledge and could back it up with science and experimentation. What really bothered St. Augustine was when Christians, out of ignorance, would try to speak on these topics and completely miss the mark and make fools of themselves. He wrote that it was disgraceful and disastrous when Christians spouted nonsense about science, only to be laughed at by those who actually knew what they were talking about. Even worse, these outsiders would assume that Christian authors were as clueless as their followers, potentially leading people away from the faith. St. Augustine's point was clear. All truth is God's truth, whether it's found in a pagan philosopher's book or anywhere else. We shouldn't hesitate to seize it and use it for the glory of God. So what we see in these early theologians, Tertullian, Clement, St. Augustine, is the groundwork for many of modern scientific disciplines and practices. They inherited from the classical tradition a body of knowledge that touched on everything: history, poetry, political theory, metaphysics, and what we would call now today natural sciences. So why did the early Christian theologians, why were they so open to pagan philosophy? Well, Edward Grant, in his famous book, The Foundations of Modern Science in the Middle Ages, offers a possible explanation. Edward Grant was one of the first authors I read when I started my own kind of academic journey in the history of science and religion. He says that Christianity was born within the Roman Empire, a pagan world where it remained a minority position for centuries. And that kind of slower spread gave it time to adapt to the intellectual culture of the empire. By the late 2nd century, Christian apologists were already arguing that Greek philosophy could be useful for faith. Philosophy and science became tools to help understand Scripture, tools to help understand Christianity itself. This is where the famous phrase, handmaiden of theology, classical tradition became the handmaiden of theology. This attitude set the tone for how Christians would approach secular learning for generations to come. Now, pagan antiquity had handed down to the church this vast treasure trove of philosophical ideas, much of which became the metaphysical backbone for early and medieval Christian thought. So popular depictions of medieval Christians as anti-intellectual or the Dark Ages ignore the basic reality, the basic fact that monastic communities actively preserved and cultivated the classical tradition in philosophy and art and literature, and natural sciences. This preservation wasn't incidental, it was a focused endeavor for the medieval monks. Plenty of influential writers in late antiquity and early medieval period who worked to bridge pagan and Christian worldviews. St. Augustine's idea that philosophy could be a handmaiden to theology remained alive and well during this period, but over time, this is the caveat here, this is the qualification here. Over time, some thinkers started to see the study of nature as something valuable in its own right, beyond just religious or theological purposes. And this is where things get really interesting, and this is where we start seeing the foundations of the so-called conflict thesis. You don't have to wait until the 19th century, it started pretty early. So as the Roman Empire fell, Christianity became the only stable authority, and a new institution emerged to sustain and expand classical knowledge, the medieval university. And monasteries, once centers of copying religious texts, also preserved key works from antiquity, and these monastic schools, in time, grew into the first universities, by the 13th century. Crucially, and this is important for our purposes, crucially, these universities operated with substantial autonomy, laying early foundations for perhaps the separation of church and state. This kind of independence fostered intellectual growth, allowing theology and natural sciences to evolve within relatively free environments. Medieval scholars thrived on organization and analysis, a trait C.S. Lewis described as organizers, codifiers, builders of systems. They thrived on distinction and definition, using highly sophisticated philosophical reasoning to address scientific and theological questions. Included heavyweights like Abelard and Albert Mangus, Roger Bacon, Thomas Aquinas, who all saw no contradiction between their religious commitments and their desire to understand the natural world. But again, important qualification here, as we look closer at medieval thinkers, we start to see attempts that go beyond the Augustinian model. Okay, take Roger Bacon, for instance. A Franciscan monk, often called the first true scientist of the Middle Ages, oftentimes passed up by historians of science. Bacon believed that theologians needed to embrace the new learning coming from the translations of Greek and Arabic works if they really wanted to understand Christianity itself. Bacon pointed out 4 obstacles that stood in the way of discovering the full truth. Okay, first on the list, interestingly enough, submission to faulty and unworthy authority. Essentially the idea that clinging to outdated or unreliable sources holds us back. The second was the influence of tradition or custom. Third, popular prejudice, which is always tough to shake. But his biggest criticism was reserved for those who hid their ignorance behind a facade of wisdom. He had no patience for people who showed off their knowledge while secretly knowing very little. In essence, Bacon's critique reflects his deep interest in the new learning and his concern that rigid orthodox opinions might stifle free thought. While he agreed with St. Augustine that wisdom should be reclaimed from pagan philosophers as if from unlawful possessors, Bacon also believed that philosophy could elevate itself and explore divine matters. Bacon argued that Bacon marked a dramatic shift in the handmaiden tradition. Bacon pushed for philosophy to be valued in its own terms, not just a tool to support theology. Then, of course, we have Thomas Aquinas, the brilliant Dominican friar who is widely regarded as one of the greatest philosophers and theologians of medieval Christianity. Aquinas was deeply influenced by Aristotle, and his famous work, Summa Theologia, represents a masterful balance between Aristotelian philosophy and Christian theology. Like many medieval theologians, Aquinas excelled in making distinctions. God is the primary cause of everything in existence, he wrote. This does not mean that God directly intervenes in every action or event, but rather that God is the ultimate source of all being and all action. Aquinas saw God as the foundational, uncaused cause, an unchanging source that sustains the universe and continuously brings it into existence. But in calling God the primary cause, he made, again, another important distinction. While everything is created and sustained by God, creation has the ability to act on its own, he says. He called these secondary causes, the myriad processes, forces, agents within creation, natural phenomenon, biological organisms, human beings have their own intrinsic power to affect change, he says. Aquinas argued that while God is the primary source of all that exists, he endowed creation with the ability to act independently. In Aquinas' view, secondary causes do not compete with or replace the primary cause. They act in harmony. Aquinas proposed that God typically works, though, through secondary causes rather than overriding them. And this preserves the integrity of both divine omnipotence and natural processes. This distinction between primary and secondary causes also helped Aquinas make another key distinction, one between philosophy and theology. Aquinas believed that empirical science focuses on studying the natural world, secondary causes, while metaphysics and theology explore divine action and the spiritual aspects of humanity. Although these disciplines are different, he said, they aren't necessarily in conflict. Aquinas suggested that any perceived tension between faith and reason or between science and religion could be resolved by properly understanding the role of each. Philosophers rely on reason, theologians accept truths from divine authority. However, again, another qualification, while Aquinas was careful to limit the scope of reason, his clear distinctions between the domains of science and theology will open the door for later thinkers to argue that science and religion might be separate and potentially incompatible realms. Aquinas and his peers were part of this new intellectual culture, one supported by the universities, institutions dedicated to advancing learning and research, and for the first time in history, a society was training numbers of students with the tools to investigate the cosmos. Historian John Hilbrun notes that the Roman Catholic Church gave more financial and social support to the study of astronomy for over 6 centuries than any other institution. Still, as medieval scholars supported the classical tradition and the natural sciences, St. Augustine's approach started to feel limited for some thinkers. Out of this evolving intellectual landscape emerged one of medieval Christianity's greatest contributions, the idea of God's 2 books. You have the book of Scripture and the book of nature. However, again, qualification here, by granting natural revelation its own autonomy, medieval scholars may have unintentionally allowed it to compete with and sometimes overshadow Scripture. As we move into the 17th and 19th centuries, the 2 books metaphor will ultimately collapse into a focus on only one, the book of nature. As men of science increasingly leaned on methodological naturalism, David will be talking a little bit more about methodological naturalism, belief in the supernatural began to be seen as diminishing, even opposing the integrity of the natural world. The result, some people began to see divine revelation as superfluous or unnecessary. So during the early modern period, the 2 books metaphor remained influential, no doubt, but as new and competing natural philosophies emerged, so did diverging theological interpretations. So the early modern period typically is divided into the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, and these divisions have been contested by contemporary historians, but I think they still serve as useful markers or signposts. So when it comes to the relationship between science and Christianity, the Renaissance in particular revived certain strands of ancient thought about nature, including the mechanical philosophy of Greek atomism. You rediscovered thinkers like Democritus and Lucretius who introduced a materialistic worldview as a chance-driven combination of atoms, unsettling Christian theologians who believed in a divinely ordered creation. In response, early modern Christians sought to reconcile these views, seeing the regularities in nature as laws of God, set by God. Nevertheless, the revival of ancient atomism gave Christian scholars an alternative to the Aristotelian tradition, intensifying debates over the compatibility of science and Christian faith. Another important feature of Renaissance thought was the positive outlook on humanity, the humanism. Now, when we hear humanism today, we might think of the secular worldview that places human beings at the center of everything, apart from any religious framework. But for Renaissance, humanism was something quite different. It was rooted in the study of Greek and Latin classics and ultimately blended with Christian theology, but a theology of a particular kind. I just want to emphasize that. A particular kind. This new focus on human capacity and creativity sparked some big questions. What does it mean to be human? What is the value of human life? Figures like Petrarch and Pico and Montaigne marveled at the achievements of their time. Pico, in his famous Oration on the Dignity of Man, argued that humans could reach the heights of knowledge through philosophy. In his view, God didn't give humans a fixed place or function, allowing us the freedom to determine our own path. Pico's words at this time were truly extraordinary, remarkable. They foreshadow a modern existentialism as much as they echo an ancient cosmology. He suggested that humanity is a chameleon of God's cosmos, a being capable of shaping its own nature. While God created everything, he gave Adam the freedom to mold and fashion himself, making humanity a unique creature with the power to self-creation. Well, Renaissance humanists were largely focused on recovering ancient texts. Key figures like Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler brought humanist ideas, principles into the development of modern science. Yes, they're all major players in the scientific revolution, but they were also products of the Renaissance, shaped by a world steeped in humanist thought. For example, Copernicus, though not a humanist himself, was inspired by his education in classical texts to challenge the Ptolemaic model, proposing a heliocentric universe in his 1543 work on the revolutions of celestial spheres. Initially, the Catholic Church accepted or tolerated his ideas, but growing theological disputes of the Protestant Reformation led to opposition. Even though Copernicus's book was mostly a mathematical treatise, he couldn't help but touch on the issue of biblical interpretation. In his dedication to the Pope, he complained about fools who criticized his work while knowing nothing of astronomy, twisting scripture to suit their purposes. Astronomy, he argued, is for astronomers, people trained in its language, and theologians should stay in their lane, should stick in their area of expertise. Clearly, a growing separation between the two books metaphor is emerging. Important to see and understand this shift in theological terms. Kepler, a German Lutheran astronomer, followed Copernicus's footsteps, demonstrating mathematically how the planets moved. Like Copernicus, Kepler's scientific work was actually deeply influenced by his religious commitments. He saw nature as revealing God's handiwork. In his famous Cosmographic Mystery, published in 1596, this was a defense of the Copernican system. Kepler described the mathematical elegance of planetary motion, confessing that he felt an unutterable rapture at the divine spectacle of heavenly harmony. Kepler even wrote to a friend that he originally wanted to be a theologian, but then he realized that in his astronomy, God was being celebrated too. He famously described astronomers as priests of the book of nature. However, another important qualification here, Kepler's view of God was also heavily influenced by Platonic and Pythagorean ideas. His God was a geometer, an artist who created the universe with aesthetically pleasing mathematical designs. This Platonic view of God didn't really perfectly align with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. While Kepler remained a lifelong Lutheran, he never fully accepted his church's official confession. One of Kepler's most important contributions was not his science, but his accommodation theory of the Bible. He argued that when Scripture speaks about common things like nature, it uses everyday language to make itself understandable. Scripture isn't trying to teach science, Kepler said, so when we approach biblical passages that seem to contradict scientific knowledge, we should be careful to interpret them in light of the truth we learn from nature. Kepler was signaling, in other words, the growing independence of science from theology. Galileo Galileo built on Kepler's ideas, of course, using telescopic evidence to support Copernicanism. He argued also for Scripture's independence from natural philosophy, stating that the Bible's purpose was spiritual, not scientific. In his famous 1615 letter to the Grand Duchess Christina, he underscored that in scientific matters, reliance should be on observation and reason rather than Scripture. Both Scripture and nature, he said, come from God, but while Scripture tells us how to go to heaven, science shows us how the heavens go. So at a time when the church was asserting its authority over biblical interpretation, thanks to the Reformation, Galileo defended the independence of scientific inquiry. He argued that using Scripture to attack scientific discoveries without understanding the science would only harm our pursuit of knowledge. Nature and Scripture, while they share a divine source, serve different purposes and operate in different domains. The journey, this historical arch from St. Augustine, the view of all truth as God's truth, to the separation of theology and science, illustrates an important theological shift in understanding the two books of God. As theology and science increasingly occupy distinct spheres, they seem to be presenting conflicting messages. This emerging tension indeed foreshadowed what we now call the conflict thesis. Thus, this idea, which many people still take for granted today, didn't just spring out of nowhere in the 19th century. It has deep connections to key developments in the Western thought after the Protestant Reformation. Now to the 19th century. The roots of the conflict thesis, again, according to most historians, are often traced to this period, particularly among Anglo-American thinkers. Scholars point to Victorian intellectuals known as the scientific naturalists, Thomas H. Huxley, John Tyndall, Herbert Spencer. These men are credited with promoting the idea of science as separate from and superior to religion. Huxley, for example, famously claimed that extinguished theologians lie about the cradle of every science as the strangled snakes besides that of Hercules. He always had a way with words. For Huxley and others, the progression of science necessitated a retreat of religion. One could not be a true believer and a devoted scientist, according to Huxley. Now, in addition to the scientific naturalists, of course, we have John William Draper and Andrew Dixon White, often seen as the whipping boys of the conflict thesis, the central figures who are frequently labeled as the co-founders of the conflict thesis. Just a little bit about Draper. Draper was an English-born American chemist influenced by a nonconformist religious background. Though he was raised a Methodist, Draper's father originally came from a Catholic background, converting after a revival meeting. So this mix of science and faith played a major influence on Draper's own future views. He went to study chemistry and medicine at London University. But then after his father died, he immigrated to the United States and quickly established himself as a leading scientist, working at the New York University. Of course, in his famous History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science, Draper argued that science was in constant progression while faith remained stagnant and leading inevitably to a divergence. Unlike Draper, there's a little bit about White here. White was not a scientist. White was also born in a religious family, initially studied at an Episcopalian college before transferring to Yale due to certain dissatisfactions with the curriculum at the former school. His studies led him to Europe, where he immersed himself in history and culture, and then as president of Cornell University, Wright promoted science and argued that religious interference in scientific progress had consistently resulted in harm. In his famous History of the Conflict, or History of the Warfare of Science with Theology and Christendom, he contends that science left unimpeded brings benefits to both areas, to both fields. For White, religion's opposition to scientific inquiry only backfired causing harm to both disciplines. So though they're seldom cited directly today, most people, when they talk about the conflict thesis, when they talk about these historical episodes of conflict, they're usually taking ideas taken from these two men's work. They remain deeply embedded in the modern consciousness. But my contention in my book is that Draper and White don't fit quite so neatly into that conflict thesis label. Instead of simply debunking their narratives, which has been done over and over and over again, my aim has been to uncover the deeper motivations and beliefs, and they turned out to be theological. For example, what did Draper believe? Well, Draper believed in a return to what he referred to as a rational kind of Christianity. Early in his career, Draper lectured on chemistry with almost a natural theologian's perspective, describing the natural laws as divinely set in motion. Influenced by thinkers like Bacon and Locke, Draper's rational Christianity looked back to, interestingly enough, the Protestant Reformation as a reformation of both faith and science. But to understand Draper fully, we have to look beyond the history of conflict, which was largely a condensed version of his earlier writings. For instance, in 1863, nearly a decade before the history of conflict appeared, a book entitled History of the Intellectual Development of Europe, Draper made a crucial distinction that many historians seem to overlook. He separated Christianity from what he called ecclesiastical organizations. He argued that Christianity, interestingly enough, was a gift of God, while the church was a human institution, a human creation, and therefore open to criticism and even condemnation. Draper, moreover, believed that the paganization of Christianity under Emperor Constantine had resulted in what he called the tyranny of theology over thought. He lamented how far the faith had drifted from its roots, stating that those who knew Christianity in the apostolic days, that quote there at the bottom, those who knew Christianity in the apostolic days would be shocked by what had been engrafted upon it in later centuries. Even in his history of conflict, Draper distinguished between orthodox and extremist views and more moderate perspectives. He expressed concern that rigid traditional faith was driving the intelligent classes away from religion altogether. His real argument was that the decline of faith wasn't caused by science. It was a result of what he termed a materialized or politicized Christianity. And perhaps most importantly, Draper concluded that while science and Catholicism were difficult to reconcile, there was still some hope for Protestants to maintain a friendship. So two key points here about Draper. Draper's understanding of history, his historical narrative, both in the history of conflict and intellectual development of Europe, largely influenced by Protestant historians. He frequently drew from figures like Edward Gibbon, and German Lutheran historian Johann von Moscham, and English clergyman Conyers Middleton. His true hero, however, was Joseph Priestley, the Unitarian minister and chemist. In one of his lectures to students, Draper praised Priestley's intellectual journey from various religious beliefs, or maybe you can say spiritual journey, from various religious beliefs to Unitarianism as a sincere pursuit of truth. Clearly, Draper was no atheist. He looked back to the rational religion of 17th and 18th century intellectuals who saw nature as evidence of God's creative power. This group of Christian thinkers aimed to show how Protestantism, in particular, fostered a climate conducive both to science and faith. For him, it was Protestantism, grounded in rationalism, was central both to religious and scientific progress. Now, White was in a similar position with Draper. He also viewed that any kind of interference with science as harmful both to religion and science alike. White made an important distinction here. He argued that the idea that science and religion are enemies was actually one of the most mistaken of all mistaken ideas. And this is a guy that's typically credited for the conflict thesis, and he's saying just the complete opposite here. He believed that while science had overthrown dogmatic theology, it would continue to work alongside true religion. And indeed, later, White explained in his autobiography that the whole purpose of his narrative, the whole purpose of his work was to prevent future religious missteps for the faith's sake. So let me just conclude here. Okay, there's a little bit more, but it's a long, complex history. So this perceived conflict between science and religion is actually a misrepresentation, largely rooted in historical, theological tensions, rather than inherent opposition. For centuries, Christianity has contended within itself over how to engage scientific discoveries. Figures like Draper and White were not architects of the so-called conflict thesis, but products of a broader theological debate between what we might call liberal Protestant efforts to harmonize faith and science and modernity, and conservative aims to preserve doctrinal integrity against modernity's pressures. Their hope was to find a middle way, a space where religious conviction could coexist with science's rapid advances. And unfortunately, by the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, you have free thinkers, atheists, secularists who take these narratives from Draper and White and they apply it to all religious traditions. So it's really an interesting story of unintended consequences. Thank you. It was a little long, I apologize.
Thank you very much for that talk. So we've got time for just one quick question, if anybody has a burning question.
Thank you. James, that was a great overview. I want to ask you a question as someone who is probably very, very familiar with the historiography on these issues of science and religion. Do you think there's a good case by someone? So this is a provocative kind of question. Is there a good case that has been made for a potential conflict of some aspect of science and religion? And I'm thinking of people like Yves Gingras, for example, or I don't know, Richard Carrier or someone else. Do you think there's a good case to be made for where science and religion could, after all, conflict?
An attempt to find some kind of reconciliation? An attempt to find some kind of reconciliation, or?
An attempt of a good case that has been made, that there is actually a conflict maybe somewhere.
A real conflict.
Between science and religion? Well, from my perspective, looking at the history of science and religion, looking at Draper and White, it seems to me that it's always been a theological debate. I mean, science itself is not some neutral thing, right? It comes with certain presuppositions, it comes with certain worldview assumptions behind it. And it was typically these theological conflicts. You know, scientists were practicing religion, but they were practicing a religion of a specific kind. So it's always seemed to me very much a theological debate going on.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much. So we can give James a round of applause.